All right, so we generated our JHipster tasks application, and we really just kind of walked around what the UI looks like, what the generated code looks like, how to run everything. So now we have our generated application, and we want to start building on it. We're just going to spend a couple minutes here and take a look at what we call a sub-generator. So when we run JHipster or Yo JHipster, however you run it, that is actually it's the default generator, which is the application generator. But what you may not know is that JHipster has sub-generators. And we'll take a look at that now. So now that we have our application, we want to start to build onto it. And the first thing I can think of is we want to start to model out our task, right? So in our last project that we did, we created this entity called tasks, and it had some properties. And then we had a repository and a service, and then we had some UI for that. So we want to start to build that out. Now we could do this by hand. We could go into the code. Everything's just a normal application. So if you know how to work Spring Boot and you know how to develop Angular, you can go in and do all this yourself. But with JHipster, like generating an application, there's a quicker way to do this. So we're going to jump into the documentation. I just probably have said this a couple of times by now, but I really love the documentation. It's pretty straightforward and easy to find anything. So if you come over here under creating a core JHipster task and creating an entity, if we look down here, here's some instructions on creating an entity. Now, as I said, you could do this on your own, but let's start to think about just creating a single entity, what that would involve. So if we wanted to create our own entity, we need a database table, right? And because there's a database table involved, JHipster has something called liquid base, which allows us to basically run these scripts to kind of modify our application. So we need a liquid base change set as far as our entity goes. We need a JPA entity. We need a Spring Data JPA repository. We need a Spring MVC REST controller, which has all of the basic CRUD operations on it, like list, update, save, add, create, etc. We need an Angular router, a component, and a service. So those are all the Angular side of things. Inside of there, we'd also need an HTML view to represent each of our CRUD operations. Next, we need integration tests to validate that everything is working as expected, and performance tests to make sure everything is working smoothly. If you have several entities, you will likely have relationships between them. So that would consist of a database foreign key, specific JavaScript and HTML code for managing those relationships. So as we can start to see, we know we need a task entity in our application, but what we may not have thought of is all the complexity that kind of goes into just adding that task entity into our application. So with that, there's an entity sub-generator, and that's going to create all of this stuff for us. So we can run it by using JHipster entity name, and then some options. So again, I'm going to start running everything as JHipster. You can still run Yo JHipster, but as I said, you do not need the Yo. So I'm just going to run JHipster entity. Now, I never remember all of the options that come with a lot of these sub-generators because I just don't use them enough. So luckily, if you're on a command line, you can actually get some help for this by just saying JHipster, the sub-generator, which in this case is entity, and just saying help. And so this is going to give us the usage. So we want to say entity, the options, and then the name. So if you have any options, those go next, and then the name. And again, this creates a new JHipster entity, JPA entity, Spring server-side components, and Angular client-side components. So here are the different options that we have. If we didn't want to, let's say that we wanted to specify like a particular table name for an entity. We could always go back into the code and change that later, but you can actually provide that as an option to this. If for whatever reason you had the client-side code already, you could go ahead and skip the client-side code generation. And so this also gives you an example. So if we were to JHipster entity foo, this is going to create the following files. So this gives us a good idea of what we're looking for. So now I want to add the task entity, and to do so, we're just going to run JHipster entity, and then the name of the entity, which in our case is going to be task. So it's going to say the entity task is being created, and now we need to start to define the fields that are going to exist within this task entity. All right, so first, do you want to add a field to your entity? We want to say yes. What is the name of the field? In our case, it's going to be name. It's going to be a string. We want some validation. Really, we just want to require it at this point. Now, do you want to add another field? Yes, we do. What is the name of your field? In our case, we're going to have due date. This is actually going to be a local, what did we set this up as? Yeah, local date. Do you want validation here? Yes, we just want to make sure that it's required. Do you want to add a field? So yes, we're going to add one more. This is going to be called completed. This is of type Boolean. And do you want, yeah, so that needs to be required. So that's the 3 fields, and then we have an ID on it, but we'll see that gets kind of generated for us here. Do you want to add a field to your entity? So we're finally just going to say no more fields to add. So here's our different fields, name, due date, and completed. Do we need any relationships between the entities? In this case, no. Next, it's going to ask, do you want to use a data transfer object, DTO? So by default, we're going to say no. You can use a DTO that kind of wraps the entity object, but we're just going to keep it simple here and say no. And then how do you want to separate your business logic? So you can say the REST controller can use the repository directly. You can generate a separate service class, which I think is a good idea to kind of separate your business logic. But then you can even take it one step further and generate a separate service interface and implementation, which we're going to do here. Do you want pagination? We're not going to on this. We just need to overwrite some stuff here because we have a liquid base in here. So I'm going to say all. And this is what we end up with. So again, remember, we could create our own entity here, but this is a lot of stuff that we did here. So first thing we did is we added a new domain object called task. Then we have a task repository. We have a task resource, which is basically our web, the web side of things, our REST controller. We have a task service and implementation. We have some REST tests available here. We also have our liquid-based files, which again is going to allow us to update a database in another environment if we need to. Then we get into the app, which is the web app. So this is all kind of web app stuff, which builds out the front end. And we have things like routes and modules and components and HTML files to kind of list out that stuff. And this is all generated for us using that entity sub generator. So I think it went through and did a bunch of stuff, and it looks like we are good. So I'm going to clear this out, just jump back to the code. And if we jump into Java, we go into domain, we're going to see our new task entity here. So it does some things for us too. It actually creates like the table name task, puts a @cache annotation on it. So we don't need to configure caching ourselves. It's going to do it already. Remember, I didn't actually create a field in that entity generator called ID. It's going to generate that for us. Now, if we need to change that up, we can, but the default here is fine by me. We have a string name, and we also have some validation on that. We're saying that it's not null. Here's the column name. If you need to change that, we could change that as well. We have a local date due date, and we have a Boolean completed. So this is just our normal task domain object that we're going to use going forward. And again, we didn't have to generate everything else that goes along with it. So I think we will end this one here. That was pretty easy to set up the entity and everything that goes along with it. And again, that's using that sub generator. And I think we will leave that here and try to wrap up this in the next lesson. So with that, let's move on.